This video will contain frank discussion about murder, slavery, attempted genocide, and rape. Though nothing will be explicit, viewer discretion is advised. Hamilton, an American Musical, is a Broadway hit written by Lin-Manuel Miranda, based off from the life of Alexander Hamilton, mostly as it is described by Ron Chernow's biography of the same name. It's the 12th highest-grossing Broadway musical ever, and won 11 Tonys. Miranda, a Puerto Rican-American performer, saw the story of Hamilton, who was born in Nevis, to be both inspiring to immigrants and, as he puts it, hip-hop. Throughout Hamilton's multiple iterations, actors and actresses of color have been exclusively cast as every white founding father and mother in the play, such as Hamilton, Aaron Burr, George Washington, and Thomas Jefferson. With that, you might be confused as to why the title of this video is Hamilton, Lin-Manuel Miranda, and Whitewashing History. Isn't whitewashing history what happens when historical figures of color are portrayed in modern media as white? And yes, that is one meaning of the term, but there are two others. Whitewashing history can also refer to the exclusion of people of color from history they were involved with. Miranda sought to reimagine the Founding Fathers as individuals that children of color could see themselves in, but the premise is flawed from the beginning. You only have to pretend that there were founders of color if there were none, which is simply not the case. Consider the Battle of Yorktown, which serves as the basis for the climax of Hamilton's first act. In the song The World Turned Upside Down, we are told about how Hercules Mulligan's intelligence secured the required information to provide the Continental Army the means to win the siege. The thing is, it actually wasn't Hercules Mulligan that provided the essential information on Britain's strategy for Yorktown. Rather, James Armistead, an enslaved African-American double agent, was responsible for this final victory. Armistead both fed Cornwallis false information and delivered to Americans extremely accurate battle plans. Sure, he wasn't buddies with Alexander Hamilton, but he was close to Lafayette, who later helped secure his freedom. Armistead is constantly erased. Hamilton says his feats were accomplished by Mulligan. Washington's spies attributes them to Abraham Woodhull. This is likely because Armistead's status as a slave might make white audiences uncomfortable, that the nation they live in was built off the backs of those enslaved, but that's just it. You can't choose the parts of the American Revolution that make you feel fuzzy inside. Well, you can, but if you do, teachers really shouldn't be taking their students to see a musical about it. Similarly, Alexander Hamilton is dubbed Washington's right-hand man in the song Right-Hand Man. In reality, there were two men that were consistently at Washington's side, although they do not appear in the play: William Lee and Simeon Simon. William Lee was enslaved by the Washington family and accompanied the general throughout the Revolutionary War. Records exist of his presence both at Valley Forge and Yorktown, and he rode aside Washington regularly in battle. He served as a butler, manservant, valet, an equestrian, and a huntsman for the first president. When Washington lost a horse, Lee would give him his. He wouldn't have shown up too much in the second act, I confess, as because he injured both of his legs when working under Washington. Following his immobilization, Lee was forced to make shoes for Mount Vernon and became alcoholic. Following Washington's death, Lee was the only slave directly freed under his will. Of course, being a disabled black man stuck in antebellum Virginia doesn't leave many options, so he remained there until his death. Simeon Simon was Washington's bodyguard. He was a member of the Pokanoket tribe, although you might know them better as Wampanoag. They weren't actually allowed to call themselves Pokanoket publicly at the time, or they would face a penalty of death. Simons was actually a descendant of the sachem known as Massasoit, and of his son, Metacomet, famously dubbed King Philip. We don't know which of Metacomet's children was Simon's ancestor, but it probably wasn't his son that was sold into slavery in Bermuda at the age of 9 following his father's assassination under the command of the man who formed what would eventually become the U.S. Army Rangers. Simons was born in 59, just after Washington's stint of terror in the 7 Years' War that might have ended Simon's life as an infant. Luckily for both of them, Simon survived, and eventually, when the general was impressed by his fitness and sportsmanship, he was recruited to be personal bodyguard for Washington. Sure, bringing up these two men would probably be a downer, and make the songs where they worship Washington seem a bit odd, right? Yeah, those were odd. These men were never brought up, and they weren't even the only founders of color. Phyllis Wheatley's poetry inspired many Americans, including Washington, to revolution. Prince Hall was one of the most influential voices in recruiting soldiers for the Continental Army. Colonel George Middleton led the Bucks of America, the real 1st Black Battalion, and they didn't need a white man to organize them. William Flora orchestrated the defeat of the British during the Battle of the Great Bridge. Cato, a slave, did most of the legwork for Hercules Mulligan, the slave owner. Elizabeth Freeman secured and set precedent in the court of law for the constitutional right to liberty. Barzillai Lou's music is credited for maintaining morale during the battles of Bunker Hill and Fort Ticonderoga. Salem Poor received 14 commendations from officers following his heroism at Bunker Hill, where he fatally wounded the British Colonel Abercrombie, stopping a flanking assault from Breeds Hill. The Chasseurs Volontaires de Saint-Domingue, sorry for the pronunciation, were the largest regiment of people of color to fight in the war, composed of both biracial men and black men fighting to attain freedom. Coquethegecton served as mediator between the Lenape and the Continentals, and as a guide in Ohio, until his death, which was, according to his friend U.S. Agent George Morgan, a covered assassination by the United States militia. Crispus Attucks, half Wampanoag and half black, or at least part of each, was the first man to die in the Revolution. United States Americans in my audience have probably heard of some of these, but I bet you hadn't heard of all of these, and this isn't even an exhaustive list. Many of these individuals had tragic endings. Some were killed by the government they helped form, some were swallowed and died in the social structures designed to keep them weak, and some have been entirely lost to history. These stories might not seem appropriate for a musical, but that's because they aren't, and Hamilton only manages to tell an exciting, funny, entertaining, or uplifting story in this time period by employing the third form of whitewashing, striking from the historical record the occurrence of evil acts. Fans of the play often acclaim Hamilton, his friends, and the Schuylers as great men and women, staunchly abolitionist and defiant of the racism they saw in society. I can't blame them alone for this, as the musical certainly tries to sell that idea. However, despite Miranda's wishes, facts are stubborn things. Alexander Hamilton was born into poverty, yes, but he was not seen as an immigrant any more than Button Gwinnett. He was white, and though Scottish wasn't the most beloved nationality your father could be, he faced little to no discrimination. He was not a staunch abolitionist either. Rather, he regularly negotiated the purchasing and selling of slaves. He even worked to get slaves for his in-laws, the Schuylers, a powerful slave-owning family that he happily married into. Actress Renee Elise Goldberry described the Schuylers as superstars but with dignity and grace. But as historian Ishmael Reed responded, quote, "Maybe they were able to maintain dignity and grace because they had 27 slaves serve them. Black women whose labor assignments left them little time to preen." Is this actor disregarding callously that the sisters thrived on the labor of enslaved women? No, she probably attended the same schools that I attended, a curriculum that endowed slave traders and Indian exterminators with the status of deities. End quote. The Schuylers being slave owners is not a central point of the musical, nor is slavery, to be honest. Occasionally characters will say that they want freedom for all humans, but history displays the opposite. As stated, Hercules Mulligan was a successful spy master because he used Cato, a man whose fate was literally deemed his property, to gather information. Cato is not even mentioned in this play, and Mulligan is portrayed as, again, a staunch abolitionist, and in the original Broadway is played by a black man. Now you might say that Mulligan and Hamilton were members of the New York Manumission Society, and while that is true, publicly professing distaste in slavery was common among slave traders and owners. While there were some radical white abolitionists at the time, they were mainly Quakers. New York's 1799 Act for the Gradual Abolition of Slavery only freed future-born children, and even then, only after they reached their late 20s, by which time they would have performed decades of labor and possibly had more children. If you wanted to make a musical about abolitionists in the 18th century, you could have made it about Quakers, but I suppose socialism, pacifism, and actual Christ-like behavior doesn't reflect the real America, does it? Even Thomas Jefferson publicly said he was opposed to slavery, but even he is not portrayed as not owning slaves. Not that there is much tact. Sally Hemings, the only individual in the musical based on a real-life person of color, is included as a joke. Sally Hemings was a child that was raped by Thomas Jefferson repeatedly, and she mothered at least 6 children from this assault. Thomas Jefferson, a slave owner, slave beater, and slave rapist, dances and sings and raps in Hamilton. He's portrayed by a black man in the original Broadway, and he uses AAVE, and Sally Hemings gets a one-line joke. Of course, it is at least mentioned that Jefferson owned slaves. George Washington is also believed to have raped his slaves, although admittedly there is less proof. No matter, owning, beating, and recapturing slaves more than enough earns condemnation, although apparently not from Miranda. Despite multiple songs focusing on praising Washington, the play never mentions his swath of humans that he deemed his possessions, nor is it mentioned that his military strategy against both the Algonquin in the 7 Years' War and the Haudenosaunee in the Revolutionary War involved terrorism, burning down villages and leaving women and children to either burn to death or escape to freeze in the winter. After destroying 40 towns, he was dubbed Konotokarius, the Haudenosaunee title for town destroyer. I hope I've proved my point. It'd be one thing if this was acknowledged as bizarre, fetishistic, inappropriate fan fiction, but it has been both accepted and praised as culturally significant and historically accurate. It's garnered praise from both Dick Cheney and Barack Obama, both of whom I'm sure can appreciate a story overlooking politicians' acts of terrorism. Hamilton reflects a phenomenon that I believe was coined by H.W. Brands, founders chic. This belief that the founders were heroic, set apart, idealists, or heroes comes around in circles. Sometimes it picks almost decent people, like Franklin or Adams, and other times it honors slave owners and war criminals, but it reflects current reality. The same attitude that worships Washington says Bush has paid for his crimes in Iraq because he feels sad about it. The same attitude that treats Hamilton as a fun-loving rebel against the world says Obama shouldn't be held accountable for drone strikes in Yemen because he went on Jimmy Fallon. The same attitude that jokes about Jefferson owning slaves allows Trump to say that people love Jefferson, and thus Confederate statues should remain to intimidate and silence Southern African Americans. This isn't just a play. It's a piece of politically palatable whitewashing.